step back to say, hey, this is what I would have done differently going forward.
Maybe,
go ahead.
Sure. Maybe just making like the solution sketches like just a little more neater. Like I know they were like it says messy, but like at the same time, like if we're gonna use that for a storyboard, it would be nice if it was just a little more neat.
Awesome. What else?
I know like with our group, most of us did actual sketches, but then I think like Diane actually did hers in Figma, which was really helpful when it came to actually putting out the storyboard. So like, it was really, it was a really basic design. It wasn't anything like super complex. It wasn't like mid or high fidelity. But like Monique was saying, like it was, we were able to actually see what the elements were, what, how it would actually like, how it would look in like in a real world setting. And then when it came to storyboarding, we all had access to the file, and then we were able to go in as a group and kind of start adding in, icons and images and text and stuff. So it made it a whole lot smoother.
And that's great feedback. So I touched on this briefly yesterday, but this design sprint process, even though we're basing it off of the 2.0, the latest and greatest, when you run these design sprints with different teams, and again, even looking through best practices online, you'll find that there's ways to optimize it and make it more efficient. So these things that you're learning right now, if you were to ever do that, if you were to ever conduct a design sprint or participate in a design sprint outside of Lambda, share these pieces of feedback with them, because this project is only being built in 4 days, so we have a super short time frame. But I'm happy to hear, what were some of the takeaways that you've all gathered, and that way you can incorporate it as part of your own methods once you go into the real world and apply this with a few other team members. Cool. Anything else?
This one actually wasn't anything to do with the actual sporting or like the sprint, but I went back into the dashboard just because I was trying to get to the pre-course like last night or the other night, and then I realized through a really like user experience like frustrating moment that that the Lambda sign-in was different than the training kit sign-in. So like, hold on, if I could share really quick. Sorry. So like, this is the sign up for accessing the training kit. And then the only way that I could actually get to the pre-course was to go through the homepage and then click on apply and then go to logging in. And then this one here is actually a separate login credentials than our training kit credentials. So, so I'm going back and forth with just one Lambda fill-in, and it's telling me I have the wrong password. So I do a change, forget password, I change it, and then it automatically updated in LastPass, which then reset this password. So then this password was no longer active, and then I had to reset it here, which then brought me back to here. And like, it took me like a good while to realize that it was two separate pages with two separate login credentials. So yeah, that was an experience. So I ended up making, two separate, what do you call it? And then this one was really random, but I thought I'd mention it. So like, I thought that this was like a button to actually click on, but it's literally just a hover. And I didn't know what its like design purpose was. I was hoping like it would take me somewhere else, but yeah, it's literally just a hover.
That's great feedback. So I would take all of this into consideration as you're building out your mock-ups for today, and just making sure that we're solving the main challenge, solving the main problem, trying to, which the goal is to see how we can make this UX progress dashboard more useful and more actionable for Lambda students. But you all, each team will get a chance to present to Aparna on Friday about everything that you've done this week. And you can even start the story by just mentioning some of the things that you've seen inconsistent or may be disruptive as part of that student's journey when it comes to getting into the UX progress dashboard. So jot them down and feel free to share it with her and with the rest of the team. Great. All right. So today is an exciting day. You will actually see all of your designs come to life. And today's lesson is going to be a little bit different just because I had mentioned earlier how important it was to make sure that we're paying attention and we're taking down our notes in preparation for sprint for the end of this week, hint, hint. I'm going to do check-ins just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And also that is going to help prepare you when you get into your groups and you start prototyping. For day 3, we'll purely focus on stitching our screens together. So just as a recap from yesterday's session, we did a lot of voting on our sketches, on our user test flows, and then those ultimately were part of our storyboard that we created. And for today, I know a lot of us do have that prototyping experience, but there's also a particular mindset that we need to take into consideration. And this lesson today is going to be focused on how do we develop that prototype mindset and how do we facilitate this prototyping session so that it's efficient. So what is this prototype mindset? Jake Knapp in the Sprint advocates for a fake it mentality as the prototype mindset. I think oftentimes we've experienced this where we are either working on our build week project or our sprint project, and we find it really easy that we just want to make everything perfect. Reading a couple of the submissions or synopsis from yesterday, a few of you had mentioned that you spent a long time just deciding what to build, and even as you were building it using software, it was really, really easy to get caught up in the little details. So oftentimes, we have this mindset where we want everything to be as accurate and as detailed as possible, but in order to test a big idea to see whether or not it's something that we should pursue, especially in a design sprint session, our objective is to really test as quickly and as inexpensively as possible. So to get over this hurdle of thinking about having to design something that's perfect, we really need to just take a step back and think that we should be building a prototype that's just good enough. And this good enough mentality, I think, not only applies in a design sprint setting, but it just applies in general when we're working on things. It's really easy to spend a half hour on a button trying to figure out what the copy is or what the color. I think we're all guilty of that. Maybe some of us, but myself certainly. So capturing this good enough mindset is going to help prepare you all for creating your prototype. Another thing to mention as well is we can't become too attached to what we're building. This challenge that we're trying to solve, this prototype that we'll end up putting together, may not even be something that we move forward with. So we also have to get familiar with this throwaway mentality, especially with working on a project for only 4 days. So this good enough mentality, it's definitely a hurdle and a challenge, but it's really important as the facilitator that we constantly remind everyone in the group that having our prototype being just good enough is going to serve a better purpose. And so leading into this prototype mindset, there are 4 principles that we should keep in mind. The first one is you can prototype anything. And so this really relates to products that are less of a digital product. In the book Sprint, Jake Knapp references other projects where they weren't actually able to incorporate into InVision or as a Figma prototype. But the mentality is whatever you're trying to solve, whatever your challenge is, you can prototype anything, regardless of the product or service. Now, the second one is prototypes are disposable. So again, thinking about how your prototypes are ultimately throwaway material. As long as you're keeping this in mind and you're avoiding that temptation to be perfect, then it'll be easier for the team to move forward. Jake Knapp stresses in the book, don't prototype anything that you aren't willing to throw away. So keep that in the back of your heads. Prototypes are disposable. And then the next piece is when it comes to building out your prototype, just build enough to learn, but not more. It's really easy to get caught up to want to design every single little thing from as detailed as hover interactions and error messages, but that is getting far beyond what the scope of the project is. The goal is to build something that relates to our challenge so that we're able to test it and that we're able to learn from it. Keep in mind when you're building these out, you do not need a fully working prototype. You just need one built out just enough for it to look real when you're testing it. And then the last principle is the prototype must appear real. So when you're creating a prototype, we need to make it look just enough so that the person who's testing it will feel like it's a real product that they're testing. This is because we're looking for reactions to a potential product. We're not looking for feedback. We're not asking them, what do you think of the navigation? Or what do you think of the sign-in screen? We actually want to have them test it and gauge what their reactions are so that we can get that type of feedback and be able to estimate what it could feel like for a real person to use this if this product were to launch. All right, what questions do we have about the 4 principles of the prototype mindset? All right, so I have a few questions in Slido. The first one is, how common is this type of sprint in a professional setting? Are they typical or are they used sparingly for acute problems or team building exercises? Great question. So it depends. For myself, we use them a lot at Verizon. And I would say that we use them because at a corporate company, when you're working with a lot of folks, it's really hard to find time to sit down with the team members and actually try to solve a particular challenge. So as an example, one of the challenges that we faced was customers didn't understand how to interpret their internet speeds. We constantly had customers calling in stating that their speeds were lower than what was advertised to them or what they initially thought that they were going to have. So as a result, that was a problem for us. We realized that it's a lot of education that we need to provide to customers so that they understand how to interpret their internet speeds. And because we didn't necessarily have all the resources and because we were working on many other deliverables, we decided to set it up a design sprint so that within that week we could test potential solutions and see if we were able to move forward with any one of them. So that was a big reason as to why we used design sprints, just because we just didn't have enough time and we wanted to test something out quickly. Now, Another way that we use design sprints is if we had been working on a problem for a really long time and we were just burnt out and we didn't quite know where to go next. A design sprint revitalized us. That also helped us move forward. I would say from a timing perspective, it didn't happen all the time. This was something certainly new that one of the managers had brought up to our team. So in the past, design sprints weren't necessarily done, but once this was introduced, we probably did a design sprint maybe every 6 months. It wasn't frequent. And then the next question is related to above, how often does the finished product of a 4-day sprint actually turn into something that gets made in real life? That depends on a number of circumstances. So prior to me leaving my previous company, we had worked on a design sprint, and we did come up with a workable prototype that we were able to test and get really, really great feedback on. Depending on how your team is set up, depending on everyone's bandwidth, it could take a few months or maybe a year to actually implement it. In our case, the company that I worked for, things took a really, really, really long time to get built. So I would imagine, I left the company about 6 months ago, that they're just getting to actually finalizing it and launching it. So it's going to depend a lot on which company you end up with and how they work internally with one another. Now, if you read the book Sprint, Jake Knapp does mention a couple of different examples of how they were able to turn challenges into solutions, and they were able to do it relatively quickly. So again, it's all going to be dependent on the environment that you end up working in. Cool. All right. So I'm going to do a check-in. What are some of the principles of the prototyping mindset? And you can just unmute yourself.
Throwaway prototypes.
Awesome. What else?
You can prototype anything.
Yes.
There you go.
Awesome. 2 more.
They need to appear real.
Yes. And what else?
Prototype until it's just good enough.
Yes. Just good enough. Build enough just to learn. Awesome. Great job. All right. So let's move on to the next piece. So in the book, Jake Knapp says the distinction between feedback and reaction is crucial. You want to create a prototype that evokes honest reactions from your customers. You want it to be as real as possible while sticking to your 1-day timeline. Basically, what he's trying to say here is being able to see how your customers respond to your prototype is going to give you a better sense of how someone in the real world will interact with it. So as we are stitching our screens together, we don't need to necessarily make it 100% perfect, but we need to make it feel real enough so that when somebody's looking at it, they could say, oh, hey, this is a dashboard and this is what I would do, and be able to feel like they're interacting with a real experience, a real product. And so I love this image that I pulled from the book. This actually came from a designer at Google Ventures, from Daniel Burka. And he talks about this ideal prototype, which should be Goldilocks quality. Now, with our prototypes, we don't want it to be too low fidelity. Then we'll have people who won't believe it's real. But on the flip side, if the quality of our prototype is too high, then we end up spending a lot of time building this prototype, and that ultimately becomes a waste of time, as you can see in the graph there. So when we are stitching our screens together, when we're building out our prototype, we want to make sure that we're just spending just the right amount of time and just the right amount of detail, so that we're not overthinking it, and so that way we can get everything completed in a timely manner. What questions do we have about building out the prototype? Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit more about logistics. How are we actually going to do this? And at this point, it's going to be really important for the facilitator to set up the conditions for the prototyping session in order to help facilitate the hefty work that's required to create this prototype in a single day. Now, every prototype that you'll be working on is going to be different, whether it's a digital product or an actual physical product. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no right way to approach this, but there are some steps that we can follow that is going to build a strong foundation for you to build your prototype quickly and efficiently. And this first step that we have right in front of us is making sure that we pick the right tools. So I love that some of the feedback that was shared earlier today, for example, how Figma ended up being a great tool, or I read in other posts where Milanote may have been the right tool for them. So the most important piece when you break into your groups and you kick off your meeting is talking about the tools that you'll be using for your prototype. In this case, because we are building a digital product, we can use so many tools. We have Figma, we have Adobe XD, we have InVision, which all offer prototyping capabilities. So when you meet in your groups, it would be a great time to talk about what would be the best tool for everyone to use. And I know that everyone is using different tools. Perhaps maybe you're working with a group where everyone is using Figma, and that might be the right tool to move forward with. But talk about which tool is the right tool so that you can build out your prototype efficiently. Now, the second piece is this idea of dividing and conquering. And there are 5 roles that are recommended in order to help speed up the prototyping process. Sometimes I find that it's really easy to get lost when everyone's sitting in a room, either virtually or in a physical setting, and people aren't quite sure what to do. So these 5 roles are going to help speed up that process. The first role is going to be the maker. So the maker is going to be the person that's actually designing the individual components that will be used in the prototype. And typically we would have designers as this role when it comes to a design sprint. Now, the maker's role usually takes up the most amount of time during the prototype creation because they are actually taking those storyboards and mocking up the user interface. So I would recommend, depending on how many individuals you have on your team, at least having 2 or more would be really helpful so that you're able to split up the work. Then the second person is the stitcher. At this point, they're collecting the pieces of the prototype from the makers and they're combining it and making sure that it feels cohesive. Again, normally a designer would be a good choice for this role, but something to also keep in mind is that this role is very critical. A stitcher is normally someone who's very detailed oriented and is somebody that is making sure that the prototype feels real. Now, just as a side note, from previous design sprint sessions that I've run, I find that sometimes the stitcher feels like they're not really doing anything for the first hour or 2. They're kind of just sitting and waiting. What I would strongly recommend is if you are looking to be the stitcher, stay engaged with the makers. Because I have found that if you are all working in silo, what happens is you get the screens from the makers, you kind of lose that context as to what you need to do to stitch it together. And then sometimes designing interfaces and prototyping, if those 2 tasks aren't combined, that can kind of get messy. And maybe you've experienced it in the past where you design a screen, then you start to prototype it, and then you realize little things are missing. So work closely with the makers. Maybe someone could be a maker and a stitcher, I'll leave it up to you, but work closely together so that you're all on the same page. And that way the stitcher doesn't feel like they're not doing anything. Then the third person is going to be the writer. They are going to help make the prototype realistic through effective copywriting. Now, this is certainly more important in roles where it pertains to specialized fields that have technical jargon or other specialized language. And it's really helpful to have someone with domain knowledge to take on this role. So as we're building out our prototype, the writer at this point could evaluate the language that's used in the existing dashboard. Maybe there's opportunity to revise it, or maybe there's opportunity to just start from scratch and make it more, to make it sound more human friendly. Then we have our fourth role, which is the asset collector, and this could be one or more. This is the person that's going to be gathering the photos, the icons, the fonts, or any type of sample content that they're able to pull in and use. They're not creating things from scratch. We're trying to reuse as many things that are out there so that it's going to be quicker for us to stitch everything together. And so this is going to help the makers, because the makers are not going to have to spend time scouring for things on the internet to find what they need. That asset collector is going to work hand in hand with them and help them find the assets that they need so that they're able to build out the mock-ups. And then the last person that we have is the interviewer, who's going to write the interview script. As a reminder, you'll be going into user testing tomorrow, so please continue to find participants that you'll be able to test during the day. Again, if you're not able to find someone, just reach out to me and I'm happy to test that. Just give me a heads up. If you could reach out to me today, that'd be awesome. That way I could get that scheduled in. But this person is going to begin writing the interview script for the test that's going to happen the next day. And ideally, we would actually keep the interviewer off of the prototype creation so that they have a less biased position when going into the interviews. Now, as the interview begins to write the interview script, what I will do is there is some guidelines that Jake Knapp shares in his book called the 5-act interview, and I will be sure to share a video of that. Tomorrow's lesson is really going to be focused a lot around interviewing and user testing, but I'll try to make sure that you have some of that material ahead of time. And then for tomorrow, you'll also get some additional time to work on your interview before you go into testing. All right, so at this point, you'll be in your groups, you'll take a look at your storyboard, and then you will break out into your roles. So what questions do we have about any of these roles?
I have one. It might be stupid, but can you show me example, the difference between the makers and the stitchers, please, so I can just like understand what these two is gonna be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know that I have a file that I can actually share that has things. I don't, but the biggest difference is the maker is actually going to, I'll just simulate an experience. All right, so what will happen is everyone's going to refer back to the storyboard that you've created, and the maker is going to go in and they're going to start mocking up the actual screens. So here I am mocking up my dashboard. I have my navigation. I have the student's name and so forth. So while the maker is doing this, ideally the stitcher should also be paying attention, because what the stitcher is going to do is, depending on the tool that you're using, so let's assume we're using Sketch at this moment, the stitcher is going to get this design file, they're going to upload everything into InVision, and they're going to start building hotspots. Does that help, Judy?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
So do you recommend, while, for example, the makers doing the design, we all like watching what the maker's doing, or everyone can like be separate?
What I would recommend, and what I've found to be the most efficient way, is when you break into your groups, talk about the role that you'll be playing, and also talk about what the goals should be. What I don't necessarily want to happen is for everyone to sit in a room and kind of just stare at one or two people working, because there could be opportunities where you could be doing something else. So have that design kickoff meeting, set the expectations, set the goals, talk about, from a maker's perspective, what do they need? So the maker would take a look at the storyboard and let the asset collector know that they need certain icons or certain images. And then the maker would also set expectations with the writer. This is generally what I'm thinking the design could look like and what the copy could look like. So this is what I need you to look for. And so again, I don't necessarily want everyone just to sit in the room for the entire day, but to talk about those expectations and then split into your roles and find the things that you need, and also be accessible via Slack. So that way, if you have a question, you could just ping them and they'll be able to answer you.
Thank you.
Sure. Now, I would say that it might be helpful to keep the maker and stitcher together, but that could honestly just be the stitcher just sitting in the background and watching and seeing if there's any questions, or they can even help out. Okay, cool. So I have questions in Slido. Can you explain the writer again? Yes. So they're the person that is mocking up the copy. And so I would let's just pretend we were designing or thinking through how to make Training Kit more usable and more actionable. I would just take a look at the language, evaluate how it appears today, and then maybe there's a better opportunity in revising the text or revising the language. So that would be the goal of the copywriter. Not the copywriter, the writer. What I would also recommend is MailChimp, if you are the writer. Is it the voice style guide? MailChimp has a really great resource in terms of how to basically write copy or write blocks of text. So you may want to check this out. This could be helpful. But overall, you want to be the person that's defining the tone and making anything that seems unclear, clear. Now, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of text really in the UX progress dashboard. There's a lot of titles, so you may need to focus on making sure if the titles make sense. There may also be a lot of buttons, so think about the call to action buttons. If somebody were to look at it, would they know what to do if they were to read it? So there may be things like that that you would have to focus on. And then the next question, for tomorrow, are we all conducting an interview or only the person in the interviewer role? For tomorrow, depending on how many people you have set aside for the interviewer, you could have one or you could have two. You're not limited to what's shown here. But it is going to be the interviewer that is conducting that is going to be reading the script and conducting the testing. At the same time, everyone else should be in that room as well, because the interviewer is not going to be able to jot down notes. So everyone in that team should join this Zoom session, watch and take notes. And then that way, that's also an opportunity for you all to do a debrief and talk about, what worked well, what didn't work well, what were some findings, because everyone may gather something a little bit differently. So it's also a great chance for everyone to align. And then, does the interview have to be in person? Can we do it over Zoom or use Maze? the interview does not have to be in person. You can conduct it over Zoom. And then if someone could just remind me on Maze, I'm not familiar with that tool. Is that also similar to in-person testing as well? Or is it similar to usertesting.com where you kind of just write up a script and someone tests it and then you get results back?
Maze is similar to the usertesting.com. It's a remote usability test where people click through and it shows heat maps of where they've clicked and they can leave feedback.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Harper. What I would recommend is at least do a combination of one in person and one Maze, just because we really want to be gauging that reaction from the user. If we are sending them just a usability, a bunch of tasks, it's going to be harder for us to see their reaction and how they're interpreting the prototype. So if you are looking to do Maze, just also supplement it with in-person testing. But yeah, it doesn't strictly have to be, physically in person or in Zoom. As long as you're getting real live participants to test, that is the goal. All right. Any other questions on these roles that I can help clarify?
For this particular project, is there a resource that we can use for the Lambda specific icons, or should we just make them ourselves?
Yeah, so I have the style guide that I'm able to share with you all, but they're not necessarily going to show the icons. So if you go into your Design Sprint Google Slides, there's a link to a super simplistic style guide. You are able to download the logos, so if you just wanted to crop out Lambda so that you could use that, that would be available for you all. Oh, perfect. So we have a Lambda logo. Yes, so you could use that. And then what is also listed here are the colors that you're able to use to maintain that consistency with the brand. And then we have the font that you may need to download if it's not available for you to use. I would strongly recommend that it really depends on how your mock-up is set up, but if you wanted to build a base or build a foundation, I would, let's see if I have the file. Here we go. Yeah, so what I would do, and I think this would be the easiest, is I would actually go ahead and paste a screenshot of what you're working on into Sketch or into Figma or Adobe XD. And what I would also do is, if you were to lighten the opacity, and this is at 100% right now just because this actually has someone's name and I really don't want to expose them, but I would go in and I may just start copying what I see here. And so that way you're able to start building a template that you can use. And maybe this changes based on your mock-ups, but at least you'll get a good sense of what the text sizes should be. So here, if I zoom in, maybe it's a little bit smaller. And then here, I have my grid that they're using, and I can also go in and start mocking that up. And then that way you get a good sense of the format, because we're not going to have, unfortunately, design access to the sketch files or Figma files or whichever tool that they were using. So I would use this as a foundation if you're unclear, so that way you don't have to necessarily start from scratch. And then that way, once you have everything here, then you can just start moving pieces around so that the sizing and everything is going to be super accurate to what is shown in the UX dashboard. This is also great too. Side note, on Thursday, or you have been receiving mock-ups. And so this is another really good way to practice copying your mock-ups. And while you're doing this, just take the time to evaluate why it's designed the way it is. Come up with your own opinion on it. You know, why would you like the spacing around here? Why would you like the colors? Maybe why don't you like the colors? Maybe there's too much white space. Come up with your own interpretation and your own thoughts. I think overall that's going to help build a lot of folks who are looking to build their UI design skill set. All right. Cool. Anything else?
Yes. So whenever we're gonna do the design, we're gonna be using Lambda, colors, font, everything. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So basically, if we're gonna use those, so what the assist collector will do?
Yeah. So that's a great point. So maybe the asset collector, if they are, it depends what you need. Maybe at this point we don't have, this is super simple, so we don't have what it could look like for buttons. We don't have sizes for that. We also, if they'd like, maybe they could start pulling in these icons that we see here. So I think there are still little pieces that they're able to pull, but because this dashboard is a bit simplified and it doesn't require a lot of images, it might not be that much work. But take a look at the existing dashboard, see if there's little things that you're able to pull in. Make sure you're having that discussion first with the maker, and if there's not too much, I would recommend that they jump in and help the makers.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, and I've also seen them gather inspiration as well. That could be helpful. Okay. All right, so we'll still have time to ask questions, but I'll move on to the next piece. And so this third step is stitching everything together once your screens are mocked up. Your stitcher, again, is going to play that critical role where they're providing continuity across the various pages or steps in the prototype. And it's going to be their responsibility to make sure that the prototype feels real and that it's cohesive. There are little inconsistencies that could happen when you're stitching your screens together that may make the participant feel out of place as they're using the prototype. So a couple of things to keep in mind is making sure that everything's aligned. For example, if you're designing two screens that link together, you may have one screen where the button is in the right location, but then in the second screen, that button might be 10 pixels below where it's located. That could create a slight jarring experience. So you want to make sure that that is consistent. Also, language as well, making sure that everything is spelled correctly. Again, we want to make this participant feel like they're using a real prototype, and so that they're not caught up in all of the little small errors that could occur. So aside from checking consistent names and labels, I think that is a big part that everyone should be paying attention to, and just making sure that everything works seamlessly. Okay, so the last piece here, after everything's been stitched, it's really important to do a trial run. And for our assignment this afternoon, aim to have everything done by 3 p.m. So at 3 p.m., everyone should be taking the prototype and running it through to see if there's any errors, or maybe there are things that have been overlooked. And that way, this is going to give you an opportunity to fix anything prior to testing it the next day. At this point, it's also advisable that the interviewer should be the primary audience for the run through, because ideally they haven't seen it yet. So having them actually test it and watch how they use it could also provide really great insight on what needs to be fixed. What questions do we have about facilitating the prototype?
I don't have a question, but can you please share with us the link of Lambda, that it has like all the colors they are using and the logo, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share it in Slack, and it should be available in your Google Slides deck, but if not, I will share that for you all.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so let's do a little recap. Why is it useful to divide and conquer, and what are those 5 roles? And feel free to unmute yourselves.
Okay, I remember the 5 rules. I remember the writer, asset collector,
The interviewer, stitcher, makers.
Awesome.
Great job.
Awesome teamwork. And so why is it useful that we divide and conquer?
So we can all get it done. Like, one person can't do all of that work by themselves.
Exactly. Awesome. Thank you, Monique. Great. Next one, why is it important to perform a trial run?
So that if there's like any mistakes, we can still fix it before the testing.
Yes. Thank you, Joanne. Okay, so I have a few tips. It was really AJ and Smart has a few tips, but I'd like to share it with you all. So if you are doing this design sprint in a real life setting, it's really important to find a quiet room. I can certainly relate to this depending on how your workspace is set up. It's very, very easy to get distracted. I don't know if any of you have worked in a corporate office and didn't have a cubicle, or have worked in an open floor, on an open area, but it's hard to get work done. So first recommendation would be to find a quiet room. And then when it comes to setting yourself up for success prior to building your prototype, take a look at your storyboard and begin to prioritize your sketches. This is also going to help set the stage to help you all anticipate and figure out how you should be scheduling your day. Now, I think this one is really, really important, and this is applicable not just in UX design or design sprints, but I think just whenever we have a list of things that we need to do and we need to get them done. Time boxing has been really, really helpful, I know, for myself and for other students that I've spoken to. So before you break out into your groups, what I would strongly recommend is you schedule your day. Schedule what the plan is. Maybe there are, and actually I'll go into this in a bit, but you should be scheduling check-in times, whether you want to do a check-in via Zoom or if you wanted to do a check-in via Slack. That way everyone can stay aligned, and that will also place more of an effort to make sure that you're getting things done on time. And that is also going to help prevent you from overthinking. So make sure that when you get into your teams, think about how to schedule your day and think about how long you should be really spending certain tasks. So another helpful tip I just touched on earlier is setting check-in times. And this actually this would apply to us, just seeing how we're going to be able to play out the rest of the day. So before lunch, we're actually going to break into our groups, and you can actually just do a design kickoff and talk about what everyone, which role everyone's going to participate in, and then set a check-in time as well in the afternoon. It might be as simple as just everyone checking in via Slack to see if it's necessary to jump on a Zoom call, or maybe not. Maybe at the end of the day, as you're going through the trial run, that might be the best opportunity. But it's really, really important, and this is not just for today, but throughout your entire career, that you're communicating with your team. I've been in situations where there's been a lot of miscommunication, and that even gets worse when you're in a remote setting. So key rule of thumb is over communicate. That is going to help everyone know what point you're at, and that way not everyone's going to be working in silo. All right. Now, just remember that we're not creating a full product. We are not to stay up in the middle of the night trying to build out and test our idea. We're just building it to be good enough. So don't overthink when you're creating your mock-ups. Keep it simple. Just do the best that you can to create a fully functioning prototype by 3 p.m. The goal here is to test our idea and to get feedback to evaluate whether or not we should move forward. And again, keeping in mind that our prototypes are disposable. So I think this is really important. So again, make sure that you're over communicating with one another and that you are building just enough to test. Okay, what questions do we have on any of the tips? And then finally, this is also really important. Make sure that you're ending on time and that your prototype gets completed at a reasonable hour. Everyone should be striving to reach for that same goal. Cool. All right, so let's do this. We're going to break for 5 minutes. And you know what? Let me give you all 7 minutes because you will be breaking into groups. So I'll give you a 7-minute break. Get some water, coffee, tea, some snacks, and then we are going to break into our teams. All right, see you back in 7 minutes. right, welcome back. So I forgot one important thing, and that is to go over the assignment for this afternoon and the rubric. So let me share that with you all. And I did add it into all of your Google Slides. So we're actually beginning a little bit earlier, which I think is great. So you'll have a little bit more time to stitch your screens together. But when we break out into our groups, I would strongly recommend that you have a design kickoff discussion. And that is going to, what that means is you're going to talk about what tool you're going to be using, and you're also going to organize yourselves into roles. For each person, they're also going to talk about what they may need, or maybe if you want to just spend the first 10 minutes just taking a look at everything that you have and to organize your storyboard, that would be a great opportunity to do that. So the goal is to just build this prototype so that we're able to test it tomorrow. And make sure that you're prioritizing which screens to build. Make sure that you're setting a schedule. And at this point in time, the interviewers should also be spending time preparing the interview guide based on the flow and storyboard. Be sure to set up your check-in points and just make sure that you keep your team lead in the loop. And then aim to be done with the prototype by 3 p.m. Do a sample run through, preferably with the interviewer, and make any fixes necessary based on feedback in time for your stand-up. When you're done, you can just simply add your prototype link in. You could just duplicate or add a slide with the link to your prototype. And then we'll continue with our synopsis. You're going to write a 1 paragraph or more synopsis of your experience with the prototyping process. Where did you fit in the process? What works well? What was hard? And how might you approach it differently in the future? In terms of your rubric, in order to get at minimum a 2, you must have your prototype built out. We must have an interview guide, and it's okay if it's not fully fleshed out. You will have tomorrow to work on it, but try to get as much as you can done. And then the paragraph, and I should really rename this, but aside from that, the student's 1 paragraph, which describes everything that is listed here. Cool. So what questions do we have about the assignment before we get into our groups?
Could you put a link to the rubric in Slack?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So for the person who's doing who's the interviewer or who's doing like the interview script, will they also be the person that's conducting the usability interview on the next day?
Yes, they will be. What else? All right, so I am going to break you all into your rooms right now, and I will join each room so that if you have any questions, I can answer them.